the OnScript Podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScript Podcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Welcome back, OnScript listeners. This is Matt Lynch, one of the co-hosts of the OnScript Podcast with Matt Bates and Dru Johnson. We are now at the beginning of our autumn season, and in just a couple months, we'll near the 2-year anniversary of OnScript, which is really hard to believe. Dru takes the helm in this episode, and he interviews Erin Heim. It's a really fascinating discussion that I know you'll enjoy. If OnScript has benefited you in some small, heartwarming way, please consider a donation of just $5 a month. Info for that can be found at onscript.study/donate, if that's something that is not too much of a strain on you at this time. Okay, let's get on to the interview.
Well, hello there, OnScript superfans. This is Dru Johnson from the King's College in New York City, and today we're going to talk a lot about metaphors. Now, I know when I just said the word metaphors, I could almost hear some of you rolling your eyes. After all, we often hear people say, or maybe we've said it ourselves, well, that's only a metaphor. But what do we mean by saying that? A new book on metaphors in the New Testament takes on that literal versus metaphorical dichotomy, claiming that it's a false dichotomy. Considering that Paul's use of the term righteousness, δικαιωσυνη, itself is a metaphor, and so is redemption, and enslaved, which means that freedom itself is also a possible metaphor in Paul, then it seems like we might want to take another look at metaphors, even though they've been looked at time and time again by literary scholars. Well, today I'm talking with Dr. Erin Heim. She is the assistant professor of New Testament at Denver Seminary, and we're talking about her book, Adoption in Galatians and Romans, Contemporary Metaphor Theories and the Pauline HUIOTHESIA Metaphors, put out by Brill this year, 2017. According to her Denver Seminary's website, Dr. Heim earned a PhD from the University of Otago, an MA from Denver Seminary, and a bachelor's in music from the University of Minnesota. Her doctoral thesis on the Pauline adoption metaphors was named an exceptional thesis in the Division of the Humanities at the University of Otago and became the book that we're talking about today. Dr. Heim regularly presents academic papers at professional conferences on biblical literature, hermeneutics, and New Testament backgrounds. She speaks and writes on issues surrounding contemporary practices of adoption, something to which we will certainly return in this interview, and the need for responsible theological dialogue surrounding the adoption of children. Dr. Heim, welcome to OnScript.
Thank you.
I want to begin by reading a few quotations from, two of the quotations from Romans and Galatians of the 4 total in the New Testament about adoption. And so these will be a little bit out of context, but to give us some background for the book. Paul says in Romans 8:15, "For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption, when we cry, Abba, Father." And to give that a little more context, Galatians 4:4-6 says, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as children. And because you are children, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hands, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a child, and if a child, then also an heir through God." Well, first off, I just want you to kind of set us up for how you got into this, maybe a little background of how you got into academics in the first place, this weird sport we do. And then how did you get specifically in this topic of Pauline theology and adoption?
Yeah, thanks for the question. That's a great question, and one that I actually really like to answer. I did not grow up in a family where people pursued higher education for the most part until my generation of cousins or so. And when I did my undergraduate degree, I wanted to be a music teacher. And I got married to a man who wanted to go to seminary. And so we moved out from Minnesota to Colorado. And he started seminary and I was teaching music. And I was so interested in all of the things that he was learning that I really wanted to go to seminary. So I enrolled the next year and I kind of set out to just support him in his ministry, but fell in love with the subject matter and continued and graduated with a Master's of Arts in Biblical Studies and then went on to did my PhD. So I joke that I'm set out to be an educated pastor's wife, and now I'm a really, really educated pastor's wife with a PhD who also teaches at a seminary.
I think everybody is going to want to know who had the higher GPA out of seminary. Oh,
I did. My husband is a wonderful pastor. He's much more interested in people than books, though. So he's a good student, but he's a little less bookish than I am, and we balance each other really well because he's great with people, and I'm great with helping him with sermon prep when he does, so he doesn't have to go to the library quite so much. And adoption specifically, this has been kind of a lifelong journey for me because I'm adopted, and so when I came to seminary and I had the opportunity to study these passages in the original languages. And I wanted to know what it was that Paul was talking about when he said that we were adopted as sons. I know the NAV translates that as children, but adoption as sons, because it seemed so. Adoption is kind of like it. Hildebrand Westra says that it's something that you can never run away from, and so that's been the truth for me. I can't run away from my adoption, and what better way to kind of explore that part of my identity than through scholarship? So that was the impetus for studying these passages for my PhD, and the impetus to keep thinking about them post graduation.
In full disclosure, it was probably the thing that piqued my interest about your book. Is I grew up, my older brother and sister were adopted. I was the biological surprise, and I myself adopted my first two children, me and my wife, and then we had two biological surprises, delightfully. And I want to come back to why you corrected children to sons later, because that has to do with kind of the excuse me, that has to do with the background to adoption in the Roman context. Okay, well, first, I want to say that the first part of your book is about metaphor. And for those of us that have dipped our toes into metaphor theory and then kind of quickly jumped out of the lake and got onto the safer shores, I think you did a really good job as compelling reading, summarizing metaphor theory, kind of giving us the greatest hits of strengths and weaknesses, and also giving us a mildly, not completely new construction, but a mildly new construction. You put a tool in the reader's hands that they can take the text. So I thought that was very helpful. Maybe you could just begin with what is a metaphor and what are some common misperceptions. So in the introduction I said people will say it's merely a metaphor versus literal. So how do you define it, and what do you do with those kind of misperceptions?
So in the book, I take Janet Martin Zoskis's definition because I think it's so helpful for defining literary metaphors especially. But she says that a metaphor is speaking of one thing in terms which are seen to be suggestive of another thing. Or maybe we can even paraphrase that down to speaking of one thing in terms of another thing. And I think one of the most common misperceptions of metaphor is that somehow they are of a second order of truth. And if something is really true, then it's literally true. And if something is just a little bit true or maybe partially true, but mostly false, then it's metaphorically true. And I think that's probably the most wrong-headed way of thinking about metaphors, simply because metaphors are inescapable. And what I found most fascinating when I was delving into this metaphor theory, and especially what's been going on in cognitive linguistics, is that our brains make meaning of things, cognitive linguists say, by simulating what's being read. So it turns out that thinking about something is not actually that different than experiencing it or doing it. And that might sound heady or technical, but if you take a really simple example like Benjamin Bergen does in his book, Louder Than Words, when you think about your keys and what direction they turn, a lot of times you'll actually, think about turning the key in your hand and thinking about which way the lock turns. And it turns out that activates your motor system, right? And sometimes it activates your motor system so much that you actually do the action. The upshot for biblical studies is that metaphors are a sensate experience. They are, in some ways, a more direct experience of something than abstract language is. And so to say that a metaphor is somehow of a lesser order of truth, I think misses how our brains actually make meaning of language. And so to say something is metaphorically true means that that it's true, and your brain experiences the metaphor as if you were actually doing the thing.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I was going to ask you about the models and visual simulation, because you gave an example in the book, and I remember as I was reading it, it was doing the very thing that you were talking about, which is a weird sensation in and of itself. When you were talking about liveliness and strength of a metaphor, you used the example, and I'm not sure where you got it from, but humor is a rubber sword. It allows you to make a point without drawing blood. And it was a perfect example of I was like painting the whole picture in my mind. Of course, it happens at a snap of a second, and trying to figure out the relations. Maybe you could tie that back into your discussion of vehicle, tenor, and frame. I know it gets a bit technical here, but
it does get a little technical, and I think the technical words don't have to scare us off. So there's two kind of schools of metaphor thought, and the one with mental simulation, embodied simulation, is cognitive linguistics. And Janet Martin Soskis, who uses these terms, vehicle, tenor, and frame, is more interested in the philosophy of language side of the discussion. And there is really a discernible turn within metaphor studies that happens kind of with the third publication of the publication of the third handbook on metaphor with Cambridge handbooks. And what Soskis is after, though, I think is still really helpful, and it's something that cognitive linguists haven't picked up on quite as much. But that a vehicle and a tenor, the vehicle is the term that we would identify as the metaphor in most cases. So like adoption is the vehicle in my book, and it's the same vehicle in all of the texts that I'm using. And that vehicle is the thinking of terms of one thing in the vehicle is the term suggestive of another. In the example, humor is a rubber sword. Rubber sword is actually the model, and you can think of it in your brain what a rubber sword would be like, that it's a weapon, but it's a weapon for practice. It's not going to hurt you, etc. And although humor is a rubber sword is a metaphor in total, rubber sword itself isn't a metaphor. It's an object out there in the real world that you can actually think of. In terms of the metaphor, humor is a rubber sword. It's a vehicle. It's the way that we can think about one thing, humor, in terms of another thing, the rubber sword. But we need the whole utterance together to get to any kind of meaning or implication complex. Humor is a rubber sword. And from that whole utterance, we can draw all sorts of inferences about humor, that it's a way of saying something poignant and true and corrective without being too cutting, or a way of poking fun that's not malicious, but maybe is a corrective, etc. So yeah, we need all three of those things working together: model, tenor, and vehicle in a metaphorical utterance.
I just want to point out that you used two sword puns, cutting and poking, and I just pointed that out.
Yes, you did just point that out. Thank you.
So one of my favorite things to do is to quote authors back to themselves. I did read the whole book, but page 2, you were laying down some hard truths there. So let me quote a little bit from page 2. You say, quote, "Metaphors communicate truths that cannot be communicated in any other way. Metaphors are not entirely paraphrasable, and the resistance to literal paraphrase makes them well suited for communicating profound theological truths." And then about 70 pages later, when you talk about indeterminacy, you say, well, they communicate truth, but they have ragged edges, right? That it's not all there and available. And this ties into your discussion of the intercourse and the implication, that somebody has to, like, I don't want to use the word flippantly, but play with the metaphor a little bit cognitively. Could you talk about how they communicate truth in a way that can't be done in any other way?
Yeah, I think what I'm really getting at is to say, just to say that a metaphor isn't paraphrasable in the sense that, like, adoption doesn't mean quite the same thing as being born into a family. It doesn't mean the same thing as justification. It doesn't mean, and I know that sounds really simple, but it's amazing when you look at the history of interpretation, how often we mix metaphors together, or we use other metaphors to explain other metaphors, etc., kind of not sticking with the original metaphor and letting it have its own implications, because adoption has a specific set of implications that isn't expressed in anything else. And so we got to stick with it in order to understand what Paul is saying. So when I say that it can't be communicated any other way, I think that's kind of a feature of language in general, that terms aren't entirely able to be swapped out. But even more so with metaphor, the experience of one metaphor, because I think metaphor actually gives us a whole experience of something, not just kind of a flat meaning. But that experience isn't necessarily exactly the same as the experience of another metaphor or another utterance.
So you talk about the idea of metaphor creating intimacy and forming group identity. I had not ever heard that before. And so maybe you could talk about how that works, and then we can bleed over into how you think Paul is using that in the adoption metaphor.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I've thought about a lot. In writing the book, it makes you see things in other areas of your life that I think are really good examples of this. So the one I use in the book, and I think is probably close and dear to my heart because I used to be a musician in a former life, is that my band director always used to say when things weren't going well, you got to go spend more time in the woodshed. Right? You got to go spend more time in the woodshed. Well, we weren't obviously going to literally go out in the backyard and go into a woodshed. We all lived in downtown Minneapolis, but what he meant was, you need to go practice more because you sound, this part sounds terrible. And what that did, more so than just communicating that we need to go practice, was that we were part of the in-group who was going to get to understand what it meant to go spend time in the woodshed. Like, it was a way of dignifying the fact that we were all musicians and we were in this together, in addition to telling us what we needed to do. And if you had been a non-musician, you probably would have puzzled over what he meant by woodshed. Now, I'm not going to claim that all metaphors work that way. Some are so mundane, like the, stem of a glass or the trunk of a car or whatever, that they probably don't create group identity to a sense, until they do. So, I understand what a trunk of a car is, but if I were in the UK, it'd be a boot or whatever. So they create bonds between people who understand them.
Yes.
And, yeah, and with Pauline theology, I think this is even more true because these metaphors are being applied to people themselves. They're being told how to think about themselves. They think about themselves as adopted children, or as slaves of righteousness, or as any number of the New Testament examples. So I think that creates a sameness of vision for the people in the community. They know that they all think of themselves this way, and they know that Paul thinks about them that way.
Yeah. And I think for anybody who is skeptical of your false dichotomy between metaphor and literal, I think it was that point in the book where it crossed the border. I think even the skeptical would go like, oh, okay, yes, metaphors are doing something much more than what I was maybe I was diminishing them a little bit in the way they were being used. Now, I'm going to quote you again. Maybe this is the last time. You say, you cite that there's a trend, quote, to view metaphors as cognitive instruments capable of changing the structure and the shape of the person's thought, end quote. So there's a lot of people in cognitive linguistics, cognitive everything, talking about what changes the structure of our thought. I heard that, or I read that, and I instantly thought of Catherine Bell's work on ritual theory, where she talks about rituals as normal human practices, just like metaphors are normal human words, but they're strategically changed in order for this new goal, in order to produce a new kind of person, a ritualized person. And so I have a bold question for you, and I haven't thought it through fully. I was waiting till this conversation. But in some way, if rituals kind of ritualize the person and create a new type of person by strategically changing a normal practice, could you say metaphors are trying to cognitively restructure somebody by taking normal human language and metaphorizing it? I don't know what the verb would be here.
Oh, interesting.
Is there something like that going on? And I'm hitting you with a brand new concept on a live interview, so I understand the results are...
Well, on the one hand, I think that's exactly what is happening in the New Testament that Paul is taking, or at least in the adoption metaphors. Maybe I shouldn't say in the New Testament in generally, but That's exactly what he's doing. He's taking an everyday concept, one that would have been familiar, and putting it into a new situation in order not just to communicate something about his audience, but actually to change how they think about themselves, change how they relate to each other, change how they relate to God. And I think there's a lot of overlap with ritual theory in that regard. It is it's a way of almost rehearsing identity and putting on those metaphors. Sally McFay, who I wouldn't endorse in all respects, but in this regard, I think is right when she says that, a revolution in one's thought is a revolution in one's world. So I think that's exactly what's going on, that Paul's trying to revolutionize their thought.
So I often learn through controversy, and the first time I met you was a couple months ago now, I guess, at the Logos Conference in St. Andrews. And David Moffat, maybe I should not name him. No, he's a great guy.
He is a great guy.
And a great scholar as well. And
absolutely.
He gave a paper on analogical reasoning and metaphor, and I'm very familiar with analogical reasoning from philosophy world. And I remember you came up to him afterwards, and you certainly had strong words, and I was not able to follow the conversation entirely. Now that I've read your book, maybe I could guess what you would say, but what was the controversy for you? And I assume you wouldn't overthrow him, but you would want to make caveats about what he's saying.
No, and I really enjoyed his paper. I think if I can present papers like David Moffat and be that engaging and entertaining as a person and a scholar, man, I feel like that's a great thing to aspire to. I really enjoyed him. And I think his paper, his work on Jewish cosmology is just excellent. I mean, I think he's exactly right that there is this, that the author of Hebrews has a belief that there is a temple in heaven, and that the temple on earth is an analogy for that, if I understood him correctly. And I've thought about his paper a lot since I read it, since I heard him give it. And I think the one thing that continues to kind of tug at me, if you will, is that he seems to dismiss metaphorical interpretation of Hebrews entirely because of a certain kind of metaphorical interpretation of Hebrews that has gone on, namely that people see this as an existential, metaphor for an existential experience in order to Christ's atonement, etc. And I think one of the things that I want to push him on is to say that actually metaphors can signify or create cognitive constructs for concrete literal events just as much as they do to make abstract concepts more available. So his whole argument is saying that this is a signification of a concrete literal event, and I must say, well, yeah, absolutely, it's a signification of a concrete literal event that Christ, really did die and was resurrected and ascended into heaven. But what I would say is, even in saying that he died, resurrected, and ascended into heaven, and so the author of Hebrews is thinking of that in terms of priestly language. And if we take Soskis's definition, then that is thinking of Christ's death, resurrection, and ascension in terms seems to be suggestive of a high priest. So I think it's hard to say that that's somehow not metaphor. Yeah. It's just metaphor that picks out that concrete action. And I'm sure he would say, well, that makes it analogical, and I understand that, but to my mind, I think the biggest issue that I had with it is just, it's the same issue that I have with people when we have this conversation, is that they want to say that metaphor somehow is picking out an abstract thing, and actually metaphors don't always do that. They pick out concrete things, and they signify concrete things.
Yeah, I think that nuance that you just made is important and helps people understand why this discussion is so important, is that we don't realize, even at the introduction, I pointed out what you point out, redemption, salvation, maybe even slavery and freedom themselves are all metaphors, and just constantly checking ourselves to see when are we talking and thinking about one thing in terms of another doesn't diminish the conversation. It just makes us aware of what we're doing with language, right?
Right.
I think also this idea that metaphor is strategically reusing language to draw upon imagery to basically prick somebody's mind so that they have a model that they work through. It can be that, I should say. This also resists your critique, or it sets up for why you have to critique then approaches to metaphor that are merely linguistic, just trying to take the parts, what do these words mean? What would they mean in their context? And then here's how the metaphor works. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think background studies are important because you have to know. I always talk about historical context like it's a light, and authors ask. They ask when they give a metaphor, it's an invitation in some regard. It's an invitation to put something on and wear it almost. But if we don't have the light of historical context fleshing out that model, it's almost like getting dressed in the dark. We don't understand what it is that we have on. So we need the background studies, but we can't stop there because the meaning doesn't just come from the background. It comes from the interplay of all of the pieces of the background and the other pieces of the context. And so that's my it's too flat of a reading if we just stick with background and we use that to say this is what the metaphor means, because it's more holistic than that, both in terms of literary context and also just in terms of levels of meaning, so cognitive meaning, but also I think affective content of a metaphor, etc.
So if I hear you right, sorry, I'm a body guy, so I want to say so what we want to say is metaphors are fully embodied participation devices.
That's right.
And there's a great Confucian proverb that says something like, "Who is the man that when somebody points at the moon, they stare at his finger?" And I feel like the linguistic side is just dissecting the pointing arm, the finger, and it's trying to point us somewhere, right? Sorry, these are my own riffs on what I think you're saying. Okay, so let's talk about Paul's world and HUIOTHESIA and what this word might have meant. What would have been the models that might have been conjured up in people's minds? And maybe you could address what you think the strength and the liveliness of these metaphors are in Galatians and Romans. First, what's the background? What would people have thought when they heard the term?
I think it's impossible to get away from the fact that HUIOTHESIA in Paul's day means adoption. There is a whole host of linguistic evidence, epigraphical evidence, literary sources, and etc., that use this term unambiguously to connote adopted sonship and not just sonship more generally. I think James N. Scott's work is very clear on that, and Michael Peppard certainly has taken that and done wonderful things with it. So I think we have to reckon with the fact that that's what the word means. Now,
Can I interject here for a second, just to clarify?
Sure.
In the book you address it, it's adopted sonship, not adopted children.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I think, well, let's start with Greco-Roman adoption practices, and for maybe the sake of clarity and time, I'll just kind of mush those two things together, Greco-Roman practices, because the Greek practice of is kind of taken up and slightly changed in the Roman period, but not so much that they're, I think, very distinguishable, actually. So in Greco-Roman adoption, you don't adopt vulnerable children like we tend to think of adoption as doing. You adopt an adult male for inheritance, to carry on the family name, to carry on the family cult, etc. And so adoption, Michael Peppard says, is not to ensure the future of the son, but the future of the father. And so we have to start there with the word unambiguously, I think, meaning that. And I think it's almost inconceivable to think that even a Jew living in the Roman Empire right at this point wouldn't have been aware of the meaning of HUIOTHESIA, because emperors were adopted and it was broadcast on coins and inscriptions and etc. That being said, Paul says that in Romans 9:4, they are Israelites to whom belongs the HUIOTHESIA, the adoption. And if we look at the Septuagint, and if we look at Hebrew manuscripts of the Old Testament, we don't see HUIOTHESIA appear anywhere in the Septuagint, and I would argue that we don't see a recognizable social construct of adoption either in the Old Testament. Now, I know there's debate about that, but we have to reckon with what then Paul is doing with calling this, I think, Jewish sonship tradition where Israel is God's son, the Davidic king is God's son, angels are sometimes called sons of God, etc. What is he doing with that, calling it adoption? And I think that is Paul's own theological take, if you will, on that Israelite sonship language that is so prevalent through the Old Testament.
And a quick aside, I'm sure you've heard it since you're adopted, and people have all kinds of interesting things to say to people who are adopted and adopting. That Jesus was adopted, right, by his father. Hold on, I just saw her wince. You couldn't see this at home. So what do you make of that discussion in light of your discussion?
Jesus is adopted by Joseph. Yeah, it is something you hear a lot. I think we have to be really careful about conflating what we mean when we say that Jesus was raised as the son of Joseph and certainly taken into that family with what the Roman adoption practice was in practice, because Paul, it has different connotations. So I wouldn't want to say that he's somehow not part of that family. I think it's pretty clear that he's the son of Joseph, but should we be calling that adoption? Because he's also still the son of God, right? And that's not how adoption worked in the ancient world. When you were the son of one father, you were no longer legally the son of another father. And it seems to me that in the case of Jesus and Joseph, it's not a zero-sum thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the other issue which you point out quite regularly, and I think you just said, was that one of the primary goals of adoption was to ensure inheritance. We can think of that as Abraham and Eliezer of Damascus. But also that you said the cult, and just to clarify, by the cult you mean that your kid is going to keep on giving gifts to the right gods, right, on behalf of the family.
Right, exactly.
Right. So there's like immediate concerns about whatever happens after you're dead in the religious realm as well. And so if the model of adoption might be something like it's to secure inheritance, progeny, and cult sacrifice, then what's Jesus going to inherit from Joseph? Like, thanks, Pops, but I got this other stuff coming too. It is a strange lacuna in the Gospels, of course, too. What happens to Joseph? He just drops off the face of the scene. So if Paul wanted to appeal to that as a model of adoption, he could have, but he doesn't. And I think you've given reasons as to why he might not have. I do want to talk about you give a translation of these adoption texts. It's the new Erin's International Translation. And I just want to quote the part that I thought was interesting, where you're kind of given if I could say how it should be said so that we could all understand it today. You explain the phrase, the use of adoption in this long phrase, quote, in terms which are seen to be suggestive of adoption. Can you explain that translation?
Sure. I mean, that's me picking up Soskis's language, just to be, to put the text in terms of her definition of metaphor, so we all kind of know what we're talking about. I think it's important to work with clear definitions, and I found hers to be very clear and precise. So it's not that I think that somehow they are not suggestive of adoption, or you could say it any other way, but just to identify that that's the vehicle in question that we're talking about. And then what I think that points us to is all of the related terms in the surrounding context. So adoption and inheritance and sonship, and I think even the reception of the Spirit fits into with Paul. So the suggestive of adoption, I think, is just a point to the metaphor and then how it's functioning in the wider context. I wasn't trying to be, I guess, intentionally vague or academic in that. I just wanted to use her definition because I think it's so clear and precise.
No, I've done the same thing sometimes too. Just like, if I could say this, it's much longer, but this is what I think they're getting at. I think it was actually helpful. The book is great. I have to say to listeners, this is a monograph, which means that it's a book primarily written for other researchers and graduate students. It's a nerd book. But it is very well written, and I actually think any educated layperson in the church could read it and benefit from it. So it's not just for geeks, although geeks will especially appreciate it. Before we go, because I'm mindful of the time, I do want to ask you, you're adopted, and so you've probably thought about this. What do you see any implications from your work for people who are contemplating adoption, people who have been adopted, who are reflecting on it, people like me who have adopted, and we always look back and we have lots of mixed thoughts about even adopting our own children. we love it and it was all good. But there is a very strange relationship between adoptive parents, and we know about the mother and the father, and we pray for them regularly. And so it's a complex topography. There's nothing simple about it. But do you believe this has any import for the way we think about this today?
That's a wonderful question. I really appreciate you asking it. Like I said, the impetus to research this was because of my own story with adoption. And I just want to say first that I had a wonderful experience with being adopted. I have a wonderful relationship with my parents. I don't have contact with my biological family because I was adopted in the 80s where close adoption was still practiced. So I don't have access to those records readily and easily. And because of my own life choices of living overseas for a time, et cetera, I just haven't had time or, quite frankly, the emotional fortitude to pursue that because it's so complicated. We see these texts get used in evangelical, I think, especially discourse on adoption, which is my world, which gives me a little bit of concern, to be honest. I think when we read Romans 8, Galatians 4, we need to recognize that Paul is talking about a practice that's very different than our contemporary practice of adoption of children. And so I think it should give us great pause before we start mapping this narrative onto the adoption of children. To my mind, it doesn't fit very well. And I actually had to wrestle with that question because a friend of mine asked me to write a shorter article in a book on reading this text along with the experience of adoption, of motherhood and adoption, which was a very difficult essay to write because it forced me as a mother who has two kids of biological kids that we're raising and went through the experience of pregnancy and childbirth and then the early years of parenting. In the same time I'm writing this book, it was very clear to me how different adoption is from the normal human biological process of bringing children into families. And so what I'd want to say is we can have a conversation about the theological implications of these texts for how we think about Christian family, etc. But it's got to start with recognizing the complexity of adoption in our contemporary culture. And I think if we read Romans 8, we receive the spirit of adoption, but yet we're still, groaning as if in the pains of childbirth or eagerly waiting for our adoption, the redemption of our bodies. And I think if you're an adopted person, you have both of those experiences. You're adopted on the one hand, but there's no point in time where you're not groaning in your adoption. It's not, you can't get away from it. So there's belonging, and then there's also displacement that happens. And I think we see the same thing in Paul. I think that's maybe the best connection I can make, that adoption is about belonging, and at some stage it's about displacement. And we live in the tension between those two things. So it's a question I continue to think about. I really resist kind of thinking about adoption as a Cinderella story because adoption's born of some kind of trauma. And I think it's important for adopted persons and adoptive families especially to be given the space to wrestle and to groan and to grieve the hurt that comes with adoption, and then also to rejoice in the gift of belonging that comes from being in families.
That's really good. It's good to hear. I wonder, just for our listeners, could you tell us where that article is? Because I think lots of people will be interested.
Sure. Yeah, it's in a book called Making Sense of Motherhood, published by Whippenstock. And yeah, it's a one article among many, many good ones in that book, so I'd highly recommend it. It's a real mix of authors and real mix of experiences of motherhood.
That's great. Okay, well, I know that you listen to our show. So I know that you know the last question coming here, so hopefully you're prepared. I'll shake it up a little bit. We always ask everybody on our show, what is the one idea or school of thought, we don't name persons necessarily, but that you wish would go the way of the dodo bird? And I'll give you the flip side, too. It'd be good to hear what's been a seminal work in your thinking, one that maybe not even one that you tell everybody to read, but one that really shaped you as a scholar.
Yeah. Boy, I think I think the one school of thought that I sort of wish would go the way of the dodo bird is the school of thought that treats language as if it's building blocks, which was honestly the way that I was trained a little bit to look at language like it's some mystical collection of words that we can build up to find meaning. And I think language is mystical in some ways, but I really wish that people were more interested in reading. I wish we'd read more holistically and less atomistically in biblical studies, especially. Which is interesting because I'm also writing entries for a dictionary. So
inner conflicts of a scholar.
Yeah, right. The books that have most influenced me are ones that I really gravitate toward good writing, and in my mind, there are no two finer writers in biblical studies than Richard Hays and John Barclay. And for different reasons, I think. But Richard Hays and his narrative approach to Scripture and just the care and attention that he takes when reading, it's just, I think, something that should be emulated. And similarly with John Barclay's work, and I know we're not supposed to name names, I'm sorry, but I really do appreciate those two have had the most profound influence on me, just in terms of John Barclay's care with the literature of the period of time that he's working with, and then the clarity of his argument and writing, I think are just two things that I tell my students to model in their own reading. And writing.
You can mention names as long as they're not the ones that you wish would die or go the way of the dodo
I see.
bird. Yeah.
Okay.
No cursing people to Sheol here.
Okay.
Since you mentioned Richard Hays, while I've got you on the hook, one last question. You do have a little jab at intertextuality in the book. And that you think intertextuality can sometimes be done, if I can say, naively. So maybe you can leave us with a parting thought on what you think is a good model of intertextuality, and what should, maybe there's some grad students or people who are running into this for the first time, what should they look out for, what would be signals that something's gone wrong in intertextual studies?
Well, I think one of the things that I appreciate about Richard Hays' work is that he's really trying to enter the symbolic universe of the text when he's doing intertextuality. So he's asking the question of not just, what quotation is a New Testament author using, but just how do they see that fitting within the larger narrative framework of the work? And I think we have to do that when we do intertextuality. We have to ask the question, how does the author see this fitting within the larger picture, and or the larger picture of the precursor text fitting within the text, the receiving text that's located in? Because every time you transpose something, I think you end up with this sort of interesting collision of implications that don't really exist in the first text and wouldn't exist in the second text, but actually entered in this space between them that I think transfigures the meaning of both things in some sense if we let it. And so I just want people to kind of stick with the text a little bit longer when they're doing intertextuality, and not be quite so concerned with maybe source hunting and tracing. I mean, that's important work, but I don't think it can stop there. It's a little bit like looking at your finger when you're pointing at the moon.
Well, on that note, we're going to end this conversation with Dr. Erin Heim today. We thank you so much for giving us some time for the interview. It's a fantastic book, and I hope you run to Amazon through the OnScript webpage, of course, and order the book quickly. Thank you, Dr. Heim.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.